We're now going to explore our newest feature, Edpuzzle Docs. With Edpuzzle Docs, you can take the same concept as there is in Edpuzzle video. Students will be able to see a text, read piece of that text, answer a question, move on to the next part of text. Edpuzzle Docs allows you to take complex texts or processes in math or science and break it into smaller segments for students. It also allows students to make sure that they are showing their thinking and that you are really understanding that they are comprehending what they are reading and what they are doing. I want to show you this from the student perspective before we start building one and we talk about best practices. Here, I've taken the Gettysburg Address with a little bit of introduction information and turned it into a doc. I want to show you a couple of features that students will be able to experience with this. The first is they are able to adjust the text size. They are also able to adjust any sort of contrast, and they could adjust the font. Along with that, students are able to have the text be read aloud as well.
Introduction to the Gettysburg Address. In July 1863, Union and Confederate forces met in battle outside the small market town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
They can always pause. They could also slow down the speed if they would like. Now, what you're going to notice is that students are unable to read ahead in the text until they've answered a question. So for example, we see this introduction. There's a question asking us what state the Battle of Gettysburg took place in. Students will answer it, they'll receive immediate feedback, and then they can move on to the next section. You can also put in an open-ended question where students can type or they could respond verbally. You can also bring in images, both to the text or to questions. For example, if Lincoln's using the word consecrate, you could bring in the definition of that and have students indicate which image best shows consecrate. When they finish answering all of the questions, they can go ahead and submit the reading and see their correct responses, along with how many still need to be graded. Let's look now at how we build a doc. I'm going to click Add New. Click Create Doc. I have two options here. The first thing I could do is I could import from Google Drive, or I could type or paste my text in. I'm going to import from Google Drive. I've selected my reading. It's going to bring that in. The first thing that I can do to my reading is I can format it. I've got some big spaces that came in. I can bring in bullet points. I've changed the title, subtitles, add footnotes, etc. Let's say the text that you're reading does have some images in it and you'd like to bring those in and those aren't easily transferring in. The first option is that you could take a screenshot. On a Mac, you're going to click Command, Shift, and 4. You want to be holding those down at the same time. And then on a PC, you're hitting the Windows key, Shift, and S, hitting those down at the same time. What that's going to do is it's going to create a little kind of bullseye, and you can grab and drop and you can grab the screenshot. And then that screenshot will save to wherever you have screenshots indicated to save on your computer. Another option is you could pull in an image from the internet. And let's say I look for a Mesopotamia map, and I'm going to just filter the usage rights for myself just so that I'm making sure I'm using a fair use image. I could go ahead and select my image, go ahead and click copy image address, let's say, and I can bring that into Edpuzzle by pasting the link. And I can always click on my image and readjust the size. Now what I can do is I can start to bring in my questions. I could add my own question by typing in a question here. For example, if I wanted to put in a multiple choice question, I could go ahead, I could type my answers, I could bring in images. One way that I can bring in questions is if I wanted to go by each paragraph, I could use AI to generate a question for me. So what I'll do is I'll click next to the paragraph. I'll click my question type. Let's say I want a multiple choice question here, and I'm going to see a multiple choice question show up. If I want to try again, I can click try again if I want to try and get a slightly different question. For example, what caused the soil to become fertile enough for farming? Once I have my questions, I can move on to my next section. Now you're going to notice we go paragraph by paragraph here. If I wanted to say, for example, generate a question for both of these paragraphs, one tip I might just do is turn it into one paragraph to start with. Go ahead, generate a question for that whole paragraph, making a bit of a note as to where you split those paragraphs apart. And then you'll see your question. You can always add feedback if you'd like. And you could also allow audio responses for students. If you want to toggle that on, that would allow students to use their voices as well. Another thing that you could do is you could bring in your own voice here. You could record an audio note. So I could, for example, give a summary or a little bit of my own voice to the text if I'd like. And then I can split apart my 2 paragraphs if I'd like. So you can go through and go question by question, section by section, to make sure that students are stopping at those chunks to do something with the text. Another option is you can add questions for the whole text if you'd like. So you could click generate. You can identify the types of questions you want. Maybe you want some open-ended, maybe you want a reflection question, maybe you want a poll question, maybe you want all of those questions. And then you could decide, let's say you want maybe 10 questions total. And you can go ahead and hit generate. I'll give my AI speech here, which is always double check the work of AI, not just for correctness and accuracy, but also for rigor of questions. For example, what does Mesopotamia mean? That could be a great question that could allow, students to just pull out, a quick recall. But at the end of the day, we know that this type of multiple choice question might be a bit better, or this type of question might be a bit better. And then you can always go through and delete questions as well. Maybe this was too much of a recall question, so I want to actually edit that question. I can go ahead and make some of those adjustments. Before I assign this to my students, you might want to generate a printed copy of this, especially if maybe a student forgets a device that day, or you have students opting out of technology that day, or a student's IEP or 504 requires paper text. What you can do is you can just select all, you can copy all of the text, and then what you can do is you can right click and click print. What that will do is it's going to print the text for you. You might see that the correct questions are highlighted in blue, but if you just print this in black and white, you will be able to have those be toggled off. Let's talk about our best practices for creating docs. First of all, identify if the text is worth chunking. You don't need every single text you read in class to be an Edpuzzle doc. Think intentionally about how long is it? What's the complexity? What's my student need? For those longer complex texts that you want students to be reading independently, go ahead, use Edpuzzle Docs. You can also put it as part of a close reading where maybe for the first read or for an independent read, one of the last reads, that can be where students are accessing the doc. You want to have a question, I'd say every about 2 to 3 minutes of reading, around every 1 to 3 paragraphs, being intentional about where you're putting them in. And make sure those questions go beyond recall, especially if you're using AI. Don't always assume that every question is going to be a perfect inference or analyzing question. You want to also bring in your own knowledge around best question practice. Like I showed some of those audio notes where for questions you can record your voice, explain, coach. You want to go ahead and do that as well. And bring in images if they're adding to the text or playing a teaching role in an intentional way. Be intentional about when you're allowing students to have read aloud versus making the text easier. So there is an opportunity for you to rephrase parts of the text to make them easier, to make them harder, where that AI tool was. Consider just the purpose behind why you're doing that. Make sure that you have a plan to teach students some of those accessibility and notes features, changing the text, changing the contrast, allow them to get playing with those a little bit out of their system so that they can figure out the settings that they like and stick with those settings. Let's talk a little bit about some of our low tech or no tech options. One option is you could assign a doc to a reading group and you could have the group read and answer questions together. So for example, if you have a group reading a book together, if you have a group that is working together on a primary source document, doing a jigsaw, that could be a great opportunity to assign a doc. You could print the document with the directions that I showed, and you could provide those questions on paper if not every student has a computer. And then you could assign some students a doc while you work with other students who need more guided support on a text. So for example, maybe 1/3 of the class is working with you on reading aloud a text while the other 2/3 of the class are working on reading that text independently through Edpuzzle Docs, giving students a little bit more of that small group attention. They're not fully on their own because they have a lot of those built-in scaffolds if they're using Edpuzzle Docs. Take some time to explore your docs and try to build one.